This is a film about injustice. Injustice on a scale that most of us would never imagine possible in this country. It's a film about the imprisonment of people without trial, of innocent people, first offenders, petty offenders, and children. And I should emphasize that those you see and hear from in this film are not isolated cases, but represent many thousands who, almost unnoticed in the last few years, have been caught in a system which has become almost as chaotic and repressive as in countries without even the pretense of our Bill of Rights.
So I tried to ask for my rights. What was I allowed to do and what wasn't I allowed to do? And I mean, just nobody will give you any answers.
What happened then? You asked a warder what your rights were, did you?
Yeah, I asked for a book, you know,
Yes.
because you're entitled to a booklet which gives you your rights.
Yes.
But I never received one. They said, oh, tomorrow, the next day.
Yeah.
Everything is sort of waiting around, putting off, you know, they're as unhelpful as possible.
To me, this 14 weeks was the biggest shock of my life. I mean, I'm not doubting that I've lived rough. Sometimes I've had to. But a rougher living you'll never get. I've never lived in a pigsty, nor at Pigspool. But for 14 weeks I had to.
I mean, I was crying all night. One, because I just couldn't believe it, you know, that this place that I'd always sort of heard about, that I was actually in, you know. And all this sort of noise and clanging of bars and
Yeah, but you suddenly hear in the middle of the night screams and someone's bashing down a door, you know. Or someone wants to go to the toilet, you know, and no one will answer them, you know.
The facts are these. Out of 50,000 people whom magistrates remand in custody every year, more than a half, that is 25,000 people, are later proved completely innocent or are merely fined or given a conditional discharge. At Brixton Prison in London, men spend an average of 3 months locked in cells while they are still presumed innocent. At a prison to which the Home Office gave me access, and described as no better or worse than the rest, I saw people on remand who are kept 3 to a cell, 12 feet by 7 feet, airless and stinking, with only a slop pot each, for 22 hours a day. As in most prisons, they are mixed arbitrarily with criminals. This film does not question the right of magistrates to remand villains in custody. What it does question is the judgment of those magistrates who, on a whim or in keeping with a politically inspired climate of law and order, are jamming our oldest and worst prisons with people who have every right not to be there. I asked London solicitor Ian Sherratt, who has studied the whole question of remand, is bail a right or a privilege?
We must remember that in England still a person is innocent until he's proved guilty. And therefore when a man appears before a court, before he's either pleaded guilty or he's found guilty, he's an innocent man. And therefore he's entitled to his freedom until he's been proven guilty and his freedom or liberty has been taken away from him. So therefore it certainly is a right. For that reason only, that he's an innocent man as he stands in front of the court. And there are still certain magistrates who feel that their task, or feel perhaps politically, emotionally, insofar as society is concerned, their task is to teach people a lesson. They feel that people can be deterred by tough sentences. My own experience from the contact I've had with people after they've come out of prison has been completely to the contrary. People come out with feelings of resentment and bitterness if they've been treated unfairly. They're bitter against the magistrates, they're bitter against the judges, they're bitter against the establishment in general. And it certainly doesn't cause people to say, well, the establishment has shown its strength, I will now behave myself. It doesn't teach people that at all, in my experience. The resentment which apparently builds up in people who feel they've been unfairly treated really only needs to be seen, to be understood.
This is Holloway Prison. A young woman I shall call Helen was sent here to await medical and welfare reports. She had been charged with stealing a cheap pair of slippers. She had never been in trouble with the police in her life. And finally, she was given a conditional discharge. What was the day like in the cells? What time of the day?
Well, they turn a very bright overhead light on at about 6:30 or 7 o'clock in the morning, when you have to get up and dress, and then at a certain time they will open the doors and you have to rush down to the toilets, and there are 4 toilets and there are 96 girls in there, and the conditions are absolutely disgusting. I just can't describe them to you, how revolting they were.
Now, most of these were remand prisoners.
Yes, this was the remand sentence. Everybody in there was on remand. No one was actually convicted of anything. They were,
And some of them were quite young, were they?
Yes, a lot of them were 16, 17-year-olds. Yes. I mean, a lot younger than I am. And then you had about 5 minutes to all rush down and queue up for your breakfast and then go back to your cell where they lock you up to eat it. And a cup of tea, which comes in buckets. They carry it along, you know, swinging their arms. It's just absolutely revolting, the food. It's practically inedible. I couldn't eat most of it.
And what happened after breakfast? What was your day?
Well, they lock you up again then until exercise time. And exercise time consists of walking anti-clockwise round a large, very bleak-looking yard for about half an hour, depending on how the prison warders feel at the time. And then they take you back to your cell and they lock you up again until lunchtime, which is at 11:30 in the morning. And you eat your lunch in your cell, and the afternoon's pretty much the same. And at 3:30 you have a piece of bread with margarine and jam on it for tea, and another cup of tea, and then they lock you up for 12 hours until 7 o'clock the next morning, and that's it.
While you were in there, did it ever arise when you were talking with the warders, whenever you could talk with them, that you were a person who was innocent until you were proved guilty? Did that question ever arise?
No, I mean, they just had no care whatsoever. They didn't seem to give a damn about anybody in there. It was their job, and they were going to go by the rules and the regulations, and you were there and you had to suffer, you know. They made you really feel like, you know, you'd done something terribly wrong and you had to pay for it, you know, in every respect. I mean, it was very humiliating, and they made you feel just sort of not even human, really. Sort of the way they used to speak to you, they used to sort of practically sort of spit the words out at you, you know, and it made you just want to retreat and hide away. That's the sort of feeling I got, anyway.
I've watched you getting angry as we've got closer to Holloway.
Yes.
Is your feeling now? Well, it's only a couple of weeks since you were there. Are you bitter about it? Are you bitter about having done 2 weeks for something that someone would normally only get a couple of pounds fine, or as indeed as you got a conditional discharge?
I'm very, very bitter, and I have just total contempt for what I consider law in this country and so-called justice.
I asked Victor Lissack, a Crown Court judge, just what was wrong with the remand system, how this whole unjust situation had come about.
Well, I think it's a worrying situation, and I think it's a situation which has really got to be put to an end. I'm perfectly prepared to concede that there are far too many people at the present time who are remanded in custody. I think one of the reasons is particularly the person who's arrested and brought before a court very quickly. There's not nearly enough investigation appears, and the bench or the magistrates concerned are prepared to remand in custody without really investigating the matter in any great depth.
But isn't the magistrate required to investigate police objections to bail? And most people are usually remanded in custody on the flimsiest of objections to bail. Yeah. The magistrate concedes and off they go to jail. Why doesn't he investigate these as he's required to do by law?
Well, of course, a good magistrate, and that's the trouble, Mr. Pilger, we don't live in a perfect world, and one doesn't know what good means anyway, but a good magistrate would not necessarily accept police objection to bail just on the face of it. I think the more inexperienced and the ones who aren't prepared to take the trouble are prepared to think that if the police object to bail, the defendant's better go into custody in the first week, and then it can all be sorted out later on.
For Edward Chappelle, it was never sorted out later on. Edward spent 14 months in prison on remand. He was repeatedly refused bail, and when his case finally came to court, he was completely acquitted. Part of his imprisonment was spent here at Ashford Remand Centre. For the 14 months that you spent without freedom, and all that entailed, what kind of compensation can you get for that?
You can get nothing. I've written to MPs. I've had letters from Minister of States. You don't get a thing. One point that I'd like to make clear, if I can, is that I think that when I was released, I went down to sign on the dole, and I was told that I wasn't entitled to 14-month stamps, unemployment stamps, so therefore couldn't claim unemployment benefit. Or you are treated exactly the same. As soon as you come out, You're treated exactly the same as a man who served perhaps 3 years' life.
In what way? Have you had trouble getting work?
Oh, God, yeah. You know, I mean, you try explaining why you haven't got 14-month stamps on your cards. You know, and it's a very difficult thing to explain.
How do you explain it to them, to an employer?
Towards the end, I started telling the truth and told them that I'd been acquitted after a very long trial. Towards the end, I just gave up because I was getting nowhere, and I sort of said that I spent 40 months on the continent because they just don't want to know.
What are your feelings now? Are you very bitter about that?
I'm angry that society will let places like this go ahead. All right, you know, 14 months is a long time, and it was a very exceptional case. But you get kids who are doing 3 months, 4 months, 5 months waiting for the Crown Courts. In 5 months in a place like this, and I mean, you can see them deteriorate. When I came out, I lost an awful lot of weight. I looked very ill. And, you know, but I've seen kids who've been much worse off than me. And again, I can say I was one of the lucky ones and had a lot of fruit and things. But there's an awful lot that could be done for the remand situation, and the sort of bail applications. And there's guys in here who are charged with pinching a car, and they're here for many, many months, and they should be given bail. You know, I mean, I don't know what these magistrates are doing, sitting up on the bench and remanding. I don't think they know what it's like to be remanded.
How old were you when you were here?
I was 18.
Was that about the average age of the
Oh, God, no. There was 14-year-olds. In fact, here they have a special building for 14-year-olds, but there are 14-year-olds on the wing who are locked up exactly the same as we are. And you read bits in the papers. You hear MPs talk about it, but there's nothing substantially done about it. You know, and it's about time something was done. And you see 14-year-old kids this high sort of wandering around a prison. You know, it's bloody disgusting.
How many hours a day did you spend in cells?
Well, here it was about 22.
22 hours out of 24?
22 out of 24.
So you had 2 hours recreation, or 2 hours?
Well, no, you had half an hour for each meal. There was 3 meals a day,
yes,
and half an hour's exercise. And it's the unconvicted prisoners who suffer. These are prisoners who are waiting to appear in court, who are waiting for a trial, and they're completely innocent until proved guilty. But here, you're treated as a convicted prisoner.
I think it is terrifying to think that persons who are on remand, who haven't even been convicted for the most part, and also women who are either remanded in custody after pleading or before they're dealt with, are kept in archaic conditions which are really rather grim and which can only be cured by pulling these places down and having special units built for remand prisoners, which would be healthy and hygienic, and one wouldn't have all these rather squalid conditions that arise now. The overcrowding, particularly with the men defendants, is appalling. I don't want to go into too many sort of details. When one thinks of the slopping out process at Brixton and the unlocking of people after being kept in custody for hours and hours and hours, it's really rather frightening, you know. Why should any human, or even a really hardened criminal, why should anybody be kept in those conditions? It's not correct. I've been thinking while we've been talking, Mr. Pilger, and I think probably I'm as guilty as anybody about this bail situation, because I think it's only of recent time since I've been a Crown Court recorder and realised the enormity of the power that you have when you're putting someone into custody, that one realises how case-hardened one gets as an ordinary solicitor, running around the courts, dealing with people day in, day out, who are remanded in custody willy-nilly, and you just get used to it, you know. And if I get case-hardened as a lawyer, one wonders what effect it must have on the court that's dealing with this day after day, because to them it's just an ordinary situation, remanding someone in custody without giving them bail.
In April last year, 2 young sisters, Demelza and Genevieve Valbaker, were charged with a drugs offence. They were innocent, and 8 months later, at the Old Bailey, they were completely acquitted. But they had already spent 4 terrifying weeks in Holloway Prison on remand. They applied at every opportunity for bail, but it was always refused. Once inside prison, it seemed as if they had already been convicted. I asked the sisters, while in prison, did they protest their innocence?
Well, we attempted to at the beginning, but then we realised there was just no point. You
all
don't get
in the
anywhere
hands
in Holloway. They won't let you make phone calls. I mean, you sink, don't you, really? Because you know that the matrons just say, well, you know, we can't do anything.
It's nothing to do with us, it's to do with the court. I'd like to tell you a few instances, actually, about, I mean, Jenny's situation for a start. I mean, she was ill anyway.
Well, I was having a lot of treatment with specialists, and I had pills and things, and they wouldn't let me have them in, you know. My sister kept bringing them, you know, and they refused because, you know, they had to go through the laboratories and things, you know, and all this took time, and I finally got my pills 3 weeks later, you know. Meanwhile, I was sort of given aspirins and things, you know.
So for 3 weeks of that, you had no treatment for this?
No,
Did you have a lot of pain?
Oh, yeah, I had bad pain
very
sometimes.
bad.
Yeah, I could hardly walk sometimes. And of course, you've got to do everything normal because they treat you as if you're perfectly healthy.
You can't sit there and say you're ill, you don't want to do this, you know.
You've got no choice.
And eventually, I mean, I got put on the Valium, and I think you did too, didn't you?
Yeah.
I mean, because that was their way of sort of dealing with you.
But everyone got Valium at one
Well, yeah,
point.
all the prisoners were given Valium, you know, 3 times a day, you know.
Not most of them were, you know.
So this was to sedate
it's their
everybody.
choice, actually, but they decide. In the end, you decide to choose it because it's you get away from being in prison.
You know.
In other words, you could walk around feeling
Oh,
quite happily
they
drugged.
all look
Yeah,
fine,
yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, I mean, they give you this Valium, and
they've got everyone under control.
It's terrible, really. The bell used to go for medicine, you know. And the swarm of girls would all run down to this one little place where they were giving out the medicine with eager sort of eyes, waiting for their Valium, you know.
You know, and they give it in liquid form.
Liquid form, and
so
they make
no one can store it, you know.
So in this way, they controlled you.
They make you open your mouth then and there to see if you've drunk it.
Yeah.
And you haven't saved any.
What were your relationships with the warders?
Well, some of them were very nice. I mean, some of them who'd been there for a while.
For years, yeah.
You know, were sort of...
I think they did realise how they should treat free people.
But some of the sort of younger ones were very sadistic and very sort of...
full of new power.
You know, this power that they had with the keys, you know, was terrible. I mean, we had one particular warden who just totally disliked Jenny and I, simply because we were in for drugs.
Yeah.
I mean, she used to be so sort of
really
push us in the
vicious,
cell, slam the door and lock it, and all you could hear was this key.
You know, she really loved the feeling.
So really the month you spent in Holloway was done as a punitive measure. This was really to give you a taste of jail, because there was no
taste,
there was.
But I mean, the taste is really going a bit far for a person who is innocent.
Now, why is it that remand prisoners are generally treated worse than ordinary prisoners?
They're treated worse often because they can't, of course, be asked to work, and therefore they normally don't get the opportunity of being unlocked from their cells. But it's quite true to say that the remand prisoner, I think, has a very rough time of it. I think it has a shattering effect on them. After all, people shouldn't be kept in custody until they're convicted, in my view. And even in serious cases, the modern approach should be, and the more enlightened court, is to grant bail far more freely, putting conditions on, of course, such as suitable sureties and that sort of thing, but there should be far more cases, I think, where bail should be easier to get.
The truth is that bail is often impossible to get, especially if you're poor or black or inarticulate or disturbed. Innocent or not, you'll more than likely end up at a Victorian zoo like Her Majesty's Prison at Winson Green. Roger Smith spent 8 weeks at Winson Green. Roger was a psychiatric case. He'd suffered 2 nervous breakdowns and tried to suicide 3 times. Then, while under voluntary treatment at a psychiatric hospital, he was arrested and charged with petty theft. He doesn't remember what or why he stole. His treatment at the time included drugs. And yet a magistrate refused him bail, totally disregarding his illness, and refusing even to issue an order that would have kept him in hospital until his case came up. Instead, Roger was imprisoned in a cell with 2 hardened and violent criminals, and without treatment of any kind. 8 weeks later, his case came up and he was given a suspended sentence, which meant, of course, that his crime had never been worthy of prison. And when you first went up before the magistrate, you weren't represented, were you?
No, no.
But you spoke up for yourself then.
Mm-hmm.
And you told the magistrate exactly what your condition was, that you'd had a nervous breakdown and so on, and the treatment that was
was vital
Mm-hmm.
that you were getting. And what did he say when you told him this?
Really, John, he didn't want to know. He was just adamant. You know, see your prison doctor. It's I'd got 9 stitches in each wrist. Well, I think I'd got 10 in one and 9 in the other through the attempted suicide. And even in prison, when I applied for somebody to come and take them out, you have to go and put your name in the book to get medical treatment. Whether you're an appendicitis or anything, if you're capable of, you know, going and seeing the PO on the landing, you've got to go. And I requested, and admittedly, a prison officer did come from the sick bay to see me. And I asked him if he could take the stitches out, and he asked me how it had happened. He said, was it self-inflicted? And I said, yes. He said, well, you put them in, son, you take them out.
Why do you think a magistrate should want to put you in prison, you who were very, very sick and who'd been under psychiatric care? Why do you think he should do that?
Well, the only reason I can give you for that, John, is he's got no incentive towards his job. He's just there, he's sitting on the bench, he doesn't worry about people's problems unless, of course, he's dealing with the case himself. But to remand a man is quite easy. You just say remanded for 7 days and that's it. There's no incentive, there's no feeling, there's just nothing. It's a job. To feel that you put a man away for 7 days, to them, it's just same as me at work. It's just like me spurting a coat of paint. That's all it means to these sort of people. They're supposed to be qualified men, you know, but these magistrates are not accepting the responsibility they're put there for, in my opinion. And they're not qualified to accept the responsibility they're given.
You must have thought a lot about freedom. Was there one memory or one thing that to you expressed freedom? Did you long for one particular thing outside?
I don't think you, in prison, you can long for freedom. You do long for freedom, obviously, but what you do long for most of all is to get to your trial and to be tried and get it all over with, whichever way it goes, whether you're going to go to prison. But finally, you know what's going to happen to you. It's a suspense of not knowing what's going to happen to you.
Did you suffer this anxiety, this suspense very much when you were in prison?
You've got so many anxieties when you're in prison. You've got anxiety about surviving. Yes, I think personally I did. But then again, I've always had the feeling that I was going to get 3 years, 18 months, or I definitely thought that I was going to be locked away. But you get so many anxieties, simple anxiety, which, thinking about them outside now, they're immaterial. You know, you wouldn't bother outside. Worrying about where your next cigarette's going to come from. Worrying about when the next canteen is. Worrying about if you can get out to the toilet. That's a big anxiety, that. And when you do, if they do let you out, which is very, very rarely, normally you get the old saying, get off that bell. Use your pot. That's the way you're treated. Fair enough, but nobody's going to live in their own filth. Definitely not.
You're bitter about a system that put you away as a very sick person into prison.
On that score, John, yes, very bitter. I'm very bitter. This is the reason why I'm doing this interview with you now, because I've seen so much of it in there. People being bullied and treated like dirt. You wouldn't lock your dog in a cell, would you, and not let him go out in the back garden to do his whatever he's got to do? Nobody would do that, but this is what's done to us, or was done to me.
Last year, the Minister of State at the Home Office disclosed that an average of 27 men and women had attempted suicide every year between 1969 and 1971 at Risley Remand Centre. This appalling fact represents the final despair of people on remand who have no one to reassure them of their rights, and to whom British justice must seem as remote as their freedom.
There now follows a statement on behalf of the Magistrates Association delivered by its secretary, Mr. A.J. Brayshaw.
That was a profoundly disturbing programme, and it raised two main points. The first concerned prison conditions, which are appalling, and where I agreed with the programme, and I hope it will help to mobilise public opinion about it. The second concerned the whole question of keeping people in prison until their trial. And there I thought the programme was slanted and tendentious and emotive, and in particular it said things like magistrates keeping people in prison at their whim or wanting to do so, which were quite untrue and unjustified. But there is a real problem, and the problem's this. Of course it's a bad thing to keep people in prison until they're tried. It's also a bad thing to let them go and then they clear off and they frustrate a trial and maybe commit further burglaries and all sorts of things. So the problem is to sort out which are the ones who must be kept in prison until their trial. Now, in all those cases we saw in the programme, we weren't told the reasons why they'd been refused bail. There were reasons, but they weren't given. It's almost 3 years ago that the Magistrates Association asked the Home Office to set up a working party on this subject. And it's just published its report. Here it is. It's full of sensible suggestions. It asks for more information for courts. It asks for a standard procedure. It wants breaking bail to be a specific offence. And this is all to the good. And it also asks for more bail hostels, which are places where people can go and stay until their trial instead of being kept in prison if they've got no fixed address. And it wants more outpatient clinics where people can get medical reports without having to be sent to prison for that purpose. Well, there are cases where it's necessary to keep people in prison until their trial, but it should only be done when it is necessary to get a fair trial. And if the programme puts that point over, it's a very good thing.
You'll never get. I've never lived in a pigsty, nor at Pigspool. But for 14 weeks I had to.
I mean, I was crying all night. One, because I just couldn't believe it, you know, that this place that I'd always sort of heard about, that I was actually in, you know, and all this sort of noise and clanging of bars and
yeah, but you suddenly hear in the middle of the night screams and someone's bashing down a door, you know. Or someone wants to go to the toilet, you know, and no one will answer them, you know.
The facts are these. Out of 50,000 people whom magistrates remand in custody every year, more than a half, that is 25,000 people, are later proved completely innocent or amid the oldest and worst prisons with people who have every right not to be there. I asked London solicitor Ian Sherratt, who has studied the whole question of remand, is bail a right or a privilege?
We must remember that in England still a person is innocent until he's proved guilty. And therefore when a man appears before a court, before he's either pleaded guilty or he's found guilty, he's an innocent man. And therefore he's entitled to his freedom until he's been proven guilty and his freedom or liberty has been taken away from him. So therefore it certainly is a right. For that reason only, that he's an innocent man as he stands in front of the court. And there are still certain magistrates who feel that their task...
...who, almost unnoticed in the last few years, have been caught in a system which has become almost as chaotic and repressive as in countries without even the pretense of our Bill of Rights.
So I tried to ask for my rights. What was I allowed to do and what wasn't I allowed to do? And I mean, then just nobody will give you any answers.
What happened then? You asked a warder what your rights were, did you?
Yeah, I asked for a book, you know, because
Yes.
you're entitled to a booklet which gives you your rights.
Yes.
But I never received one. They said, oh, tomorrow, the next day.
Yeah.
Everything is sort of waiting around, putting off, you know, they're as unhelpful as possible.
To me, this 14 weeks was the biggest shock of my life. I mean, I'm not doubting I've lived rough. Sometimes I've had to. But a rougher live.
This is a film about injustice. Injustice on a scale that most of us would never imagine possible in this country. It's a film about the imprisonment of people without trial, of innocent people, first offenders, petty offenders, and children. And I should emphasize that those you see and hear from in this film are not isolated cases, but represent many thousands really fined or given a conditional discharge. At Brixton Prison in London, men spend an average of 3 months locked in cells while they are still presumed innocent. At a prison to which the Home Office gave me access, and described as no better or worse than the rest, I saw people on remand who are kept 3 to a cell, 12 feet by 7 feet, airless and stinking, with only a slop pot each, for 22 hours a day. As in most prisons, they are mixed arbitrarily with criminals. This film does not question the right of magistrates to remand villains in custody. What it does question is the judgment of those magistrates who, on a whim or in keeping with a politically inspired climate of law and order, are jamming our